talk about today is based on the research that we've been doing probably for the last 10, 15 years around, it started looking at deinstitutionalization and what community living was like for people who moved out of institutions. And then that took us into this whole area of the culture of group homes and what culture in underperforming poor services looked like. And that was all really depressing. So we went off and tried to then look at, well, what does good culture look like? What do good services look like? And what are some of the factors that are responsible for that? And that work is just finally sort of evolving, so I want to test some of it with you a bit today. And the other thing we've been doing during this time is working a lot with Jim Mansell, the late Jim Mansell from the UK, and Julie Beadle-Brown, looking at active support, which is one practice, really strong evidence-based practice, and trying to work out how you can embed that in services. So what are the factors that you need in a service to get good practice? And we're sort of 3 years into a longitudinal study around that. So that's the sort of basis from which I'm talking. What I want to talk about first of all is about some of the variability in outcomes and how we understand some of that, some of the things that make a difference, that we think make a difference. And then if you look at those things that we think make a difference, what do you need within organisations, within your structures and processes and the way you work to embed those things that are going to deliver good outcomes. So that's my plan. So the variability of community services. So in Australia, since the sort of mid-1980s, we've been developing community services. A lot of those services have been supported accommodation services, but we've had obviously day services and other types of services as well. And one of the striking things in all of the research, both from the UK and from Australia, is that they're very variable. We can't say we're delivering good quality or bad quality services. We're delivering services of all sorts of differing quality at differing times. And we can say with certainty that the institutions that people have come out of or that we used to have will never be as good as the really good community-based services. But what we can't say, though, is that some of the worst community-based services are actually worse than some of the best institutions. So some services have got a long way to go in terms of delivering quality outcomes. And if you look at some of the measures, and a measure of engagement is one of the easiest ones to look at that variability. So engagement is looking at, well, what is somebody doing? How many minutes of an hour or what percentage of their time are they engaged in doing something meaningful or talking to somebody, having a relationship during a day? And what the research shows is that it's hugely variable, from 8% of their day to 74% of their day. Most of us are engaged for probably 95% of our day. And if you look at that another way, some of our research in Victoria has shown that for some people who live in supported accommodation, who have 24-hour staff there all the time, have contact or support from those staff for 3 minutes in every hour. So what's the staff doing for the rest of the time, one has to ask. But the point is, there's enormous variability. There are some good services there and there's some really poor services. So the research has shifted from looking at what's the difference between institutions and supported living and community living to, okay, how can we work out how do we get good outcomes in community living? So what's associated with those good outcomes? What does it take to get good quality outcomes to make that happen? And then after that, what does it take to make it keep happening? So if we can do it once, if a service can start to deliver that, how does it keep that consistency of service over time? And what our research has shown is that it goes up and down over time. So how do you keep that continuity? We did a scan of the literature a number of years ago and found that there's something like 60 variables that various researchers had looked at which are responsible for, people have said, influence outcomes. And also there's about 53 outcome clusters that people have used in the research. So it's a hugely difficult field to grasp hold of. And people have done that in various ways. People have looked at, from a systems perspective, what are the types and range of variables that are the most important ones that we need to embed in services if we're going to get good outcomes. People have often used very generic terms. So people have said, oh, training's important, or qualifications are important, or the mission of the service are important. But they haven't actually articulated very well, what do we mean by training? What type of training is important? And there's beginning to be increasing evidence about some of the value of those variables. So, for example, in active support, training of a particular type doesn't have any value at all. Just having classroom training doesn't work. If you have classroom training plus hands-on training, then you'll get a good outcome. So it's not only looking at that big picture headlines, it's what's actually underneath. How do we have to deliver those things? What are the key components that are important? And one of the things that runs all the way through the literature is the importance of culture in services. And yet almost nobody has actually said, well, what type of culture? What does culture in good services look like? And that's been one of the challenges for us, and I'll talk some more about that. So the challenge really is to, from all of those variables that have been identified, to work out which are the ones that are most important and which ones don't matter so much, or which ones in combination are most important. So is it A, B and C? Does that get a good outcome? But would you also get a good outcome if you have F, G, H and I? So it's a very complex sort of world of trying to work out what are the best things. And I don't think anybody has those answers, but we're beginning to move quite a way down the path of some of those. These are some quotes from some of the older literature. Stancliffe said in 2014, you know, there's a multiplicity of outcomes and process variables. It's bewildering. And I don't think it's not so bewildering now as it was then. And back in 1988, David Fels actually said, well, it's too difficult. You know, should we spend our time, should this be a priority, trying to work out what the important variables are? And I think that was quite influential because nobody's really spent a lot of time doing that. But now it's a really pressing issue. So if we're going to invest twice as much in disability services as we've had invested before, then we have to make sure that they're effective, that they're delivering what we're wanting them to deliver. And that means that they're delivering the quality outcomes that people are expecting from that investment. And we know to date, on a global sense, that they haven't been delivering those outcomes. We don't know in detail, but what we do know is that people are still fairly excluded, people still don't have employment, people still have relatively poor health, a whole range of those indicators we haven't got very far on over the last 20 years with our investments. So trying to work out what are the main factors that make a difference in terms of effective service delivery has now become, I think, a really important issue. But it comes down then to the question is it knowable? Can we actually know what makes the difference? And it's here where the idea of complex or complicated is fairly useful. I used to work with somebody who was brilliant at collecting the details of things, but he couldn't rise above that. And so for him, the whole world was really complex, which meant it was basically unknowable. He could see there were so many tiny things that made a difference that he couldn't grab hold of the most important things. He couldn't see any pattern. So a complicated picture is a picture where there's multiple variables, but where you can actually work out a cause and effect. So there are some patterns that you can grab hold of over time through research and through consistent observation. So you can make that's predictable. You can say, if you bring these things together, we will get these outcomes, or we'll approximate to these outcomes. So it's essentially knowable, but it might be quite challenging and difficult to know. In a complex system, it's uncertain, it's unpredictable, and you really don't know what the outcome's going to be. And I think we have to hope that what we're trying to deliver is complicated things, so that we can know those outcomes. So we can know, for example, how to put people on the moon. So we need to think about our services as they're really complicated to work out, but we can know that. It's not like trying to raise children, where there are so many variables and it's so unpredictable that you'll never be able to know what the outcome's likely to be, although you might know some trends. So I think we have to live in hope that it is knowable and it's not difficult. It is difficult, but it doesn't come down to personalities and individual people. It's got to come down to some things that are much more predictable than that we can control. So this was our starting point a number of years ago, and I'm going to unpack some of this, but I'll just sort of run you through that diagram. So we had this proposition that what makes a difference, and you'll get good quality outcomes when you have the interaction of these 6 interacting elements. And this is, I guess, particularly in relation to supported accommodation, but it can be extrapolated to other types of services quite easily. That you will always need some necessary conditions, but not sufficient ones. So in supported accommodation, you have to have adequate resources. And we know once you have more than adequate resources, you can actually have too many resources. And then that doesn't make the outcome any better. So you need adequate resources. You need a design, you need a type and a size of service that will not obstruct the outcomes that you're getting. So we know categorically that small size ordinary houses work in the community. If you congregate more than 6 or 7 people together under one roof with an intellectual disability, then that's going to obstruct social inclusion. So if you want social inclusion and you want good outcomes, you have to have those necessary conditions. Small size and a design that's going to be ordinary houses in ordinary streets. Then you need some organisational stuff. So you need a coherence of organisational values and policies and missions and procedures which put the service user at the centre of all of those things. And I'm going to come back to that and what are good indicators of those procedures, structures and processes that you need within a service. You need an informal culture, and I'll come back to what that culture might look like, that is congruent and supports the formal mission of the organisation, of what you're trying to achieve. If you have a culture in your services that are dispersed, either a group home or in some of your outreach services or even some of your individual home-based services, that is different from what you're trying to achieve, then that's going to be contrary to being able to achieve good outcomes, because they're going to be working in a different way from the way your organisation thinks they're working. So culture of services, whatever level, is really important. You need an external environment that's congruent and reinforces the mission and the values of the organisation. Now, for the first time in years, we have this amazing external environment. People with disabilities are now in the media almost every day. And that's so remarkable. I mean, I remember even 5 years ago, if you saw disability in the media, it was, oh, isn't that exciting? But now they're there, they're out there. It's a much more conducive environment to getting good services up and getting the support for them. And changing the community attitudes which you need in order to go together with the services that you're delivering. You need to have in your service, everybody has different participants in their services, different service users, people that they're supporting, and every service needs to make sure that it has knowledge, staff practices that compensate and understand the particular characteristics and impairments of the people that they're supporting in order to counter the disadvantage that people experience from having those impairments. So you need knowledge of the people that you're serving. And most importantly, I guess so far in terms of the evidence that we have, is that you need staff and managerial working practices that reflect organisational values and policies. So if you have a set of organisational policies over here, you need staff working practices that reflect those organisational values day in, day out. And the research shows really clearly that it's what the staff do day in, day out that makes the most critical difference to the outcomes that people experience. And yet, I think in many organisations, the staff practices are left to the most unskilled, untrained, casual people, undervalued within the organisation. It's often what we pay least attention to. And as Chris often says, well, we don't do that in medicine, do we? The most skilled people in the hospital system, in the medical system, are the frontline doctors, the people that fiddle around with you. And it's the same in relation to disability support services. We need to pay attention to that skill of the staff and the interactions and what they're doing. And increasingly, there's been a lot of research around active support, and the work that Julie Beadle-Brown's been doing in the UK suggests that the principles of active support are a good proxy for good support. So in organisations that are using the principles of active support, which is enabling the people they're working with to be engaged in meaningful activity and social relationships, enabling those people to have choice and control and to succeed, that those practices are actually associated with a lot of the other person-centred practices. So if you're doing good active support, you're also likely to be doing good positive behaviour support. You're likely to be having good communication skills. You're likely to be reflecting the SPELL framework around supporting the environment of people who have autism and making sure that the environment's sensitive to them. So those are the range of important things, 6 elements that are key to thinking about good outcomes. The other set of things are around the culture, and this reflects our studies of culture in group homes, but I think it's also applicable to day services if you make that sort of connection. I don't want to dwell on the negative end of these 5 dimensions that we identified, but they're worrying in the fact that they resonate with an awful lot of services. We identified 5 dimensions, and the first dimension was around the alignment of the power holder values. So what was the values of the people who held the power within the service? And what we found was, first of all, the people who held the power didn't necessarily line up with who was supposed to be holding the power in the organisation structure. So you might have a house supervisor who should hold the power, but actually it was held by a very small clique of staff whose values were quite different from the values of the organisation and who actively undermined the values of the organisation and worked contrary to the house supervisor. We also found in some instances that the house supervisor might hold the values, might hold the power, but not reflect the values of the organisation, which is just as problematic. We found quite worryingly, and we thought this was probably a key one in terms of culture, was the way in which the residents, the people that were being supported, were regarded. That in the underperforming houses we looked at, there was a sense of otherness, that the people that were being supported weren't like us. They weren't like the staff, they were different. So they had different crockery, so they had different toilets. So they were treated and seen not as company, not as people, but as the other. And that's very reflective of institutional practices. That the perceived purpose of the service was doing things for people. So there was a sense from staff that we look after them. We look after them, we take them out into the community, and we look after the house. And that's our job. So the purpose of being there is to look after people. The working practices were centred around the staff. So we do what suits us, what will make our job easier. We get it done, we get all the tasks done, the cooking and the mopping and the cleaning, and the feeding and the showering so that we can sit down and have a rest, which is task-centred type of work. And that the orientation to change in these negative cultures were around, yes, but, it's too hard, or yes, but we'll get to it next week, or it's not such a good idea after all. So resistance to change and things from the outside world. And unfortunately, I think if you look further afield, a lot of the services in Victoria and in Australia, that's what the culture looks like. So we spent a lot of time trying to find some really good services and to look at what the culture was in those services and to try and understand what drove a better culture, which was more in tune with being able to produce good outcomes. And we did find some, but our analysis shows that what we found is not actually the polar end of these dimensions. We've got somewhere along the way. So we've got a group of what we call better group homes. We think they could be really good if they shifted a little bit further. But it's worth sharing what the culture in a good service looks like. And if you look at the dimension around the alignment of power holder values, in the better services, you find that there's a line-up. So the power is held where it's supposed to be held, according to the organisational structure. So the team leader, the house supervisor, holds that power. But the important thing is that they also share that power. So there's a sense of shared responsibility among all the staff in those services. So their values line up with the organisation, and the values of the leader line up with the organisation, as do the rest of the staff. And that's really important. How does that get achieved? That comes down to organisational practices. And there's open dialogue. There aren't cliques. There aren't things going on behind the scenes in these good services. There's open dialogue and challenge, so that if somebody isn't happy or somebody doesn't agree with what's going on, you can reflect on it and put it out in the open. And then maybe that gets incorporated into the shared values and approaches. In terms of regard for residents, these residents in good services are seen as people who are the same as other citizens, that they have the same essential humanity as the staff and as anybody else in the community. But at the same time, the staff hold this tension between these are people like us, but actually these are people who have some differences from us. And so we have to pay attention to those differences as well. So we have to hold the common humanity, but we have to pay attention to differences. So it's not ignoring differences. It's providing the support that people need in order to do the things that they want to do, in order to do the things that other citizens are doing. In terms of the perceived purpose, we thought that the other end of this dimension would be, if we said the negative was doing things for people, we thought that the other end would be doing things with people. But we were a bit wrong there. What we found was the other end of that is making life what people want it to be. So the most dominant thing was actually choice. That the staff saw the purpose of being there was to support people's lives to how they wanted it to be. So the choice of the person was the predominant part of that culture. And they would amend, so they had very flexible working practices, so they could amend and mould around what people wanted. Doing tasks wasn't the most important, wasn't seen as the purpose. Taking care of people wasn't seen as the purpose. But there was also a sense that the purpose was also to include people. So staff would support people to be included in everything that happened in the house and in things out in the community. So the purpose was for people to have their life that they wanted, to exercise their choice, to be included. But staff also saw their purpose as being to provide care and comfort for people as well, to recognise that care and comfort in personal care and in healthcare was fundamental to their purpose. But it wasn't looking after people in that very patronising sense. In terms of working practices, it's very clear that in the good cultures, there's a sense of they're person-centred. So it's about the person, it's not about tasks, it's not about the staff, which means all of their working practices were attentive to what they thought the person needed. And the staff spent a lot of time trying to work out what the person needed. So people who don't have communication skills, people who have profound and severe disabilities, staff looked at them. They spent a lot of time observing, sharing information, trying to work out how to attend to their needs and what their preferences were. And they delivered their support in a relational way. There was a commitment by the staff to every person that they worked with, and they provided that support in a relationship. And that's quite a challenge, I think. The staff in these houses where there was this really good culture saw people in many ways as their friends. And that's challenging for many professionals. But it seems to be an inherent part of good culture and services that you have a commitment to, and a relationship with the people that you're working with. And then finally, in terms of the culture in these services, there was a sense of openness. The staff and the leaders were open to change, were open to the outside world and to ideas from the outside world. They didn't think they knew it all. They weren't in opposition to the organisation they were working with or to policy. They felt they could learn from those things outside, but they also saw themselves as leaders to the outside world, that other people could learn from them. So there was a very porous sort of boundaries for those organisations. So that raises for us then, well, how do you embed that type of culture in an organisation? What do you need to bring that about? And I don't suggest that we have all the answers, but we have some clues around some of those things. If you think about usually how you conceptualise services, this is the sort of standard diagram that you get. You think about structures, policies and procedures, and usually they're the biggest box and they're what people focus on. And Chris and I have been doing some work recently about looking at quality assurance systems, and it's really interesting. Most quality assurance systems look at structures, policies and processes. Are you a good organisation? Do you have good financial audits? Do you have good governance practices? And all of those things. But they pay very little attention to practice and outcomes. And what Jim Mansell did in a presentation many years ago, he said, let's look at the other way. Let's start from the right and go to the left, rather than going from the whatever. Let's go from this end that way, rather than that end that way. So that's what I'm going to do, is to try and unpack what outcomes you might be thinking about, and then what are some of the fundamental things that you need in your organisation to get those sorts of outcomes. So outcomes, for many people, roll off the tongue really easily. I bet you could all say, what are the outcomes of the NDIS? What's trying to be achieved? And inclusion, participation, choice and control. That's the outcomes that are now mandated in legislation. And that really turns into, well, what sort of life is it that people are wanting to lead? And Jane's talked a lot about the life that her son wants to lead, which is probably fairly similar to the life of a lot of young people. It's about maybe employment, earnings, having a career, being engaged in meaningful activity, having control and direction about your own life, and having relationships and connections with other people, whether it's your family, whether it's intimate partners, or whether it's people in the wider community. And being respected for the person that you are, and not somebody that somebody else wants you to be. But services are also concerned, I think, and have to be concerned with outcomes for other people. So they have to pay attention for outcomes too, for the experiences of family members and the experiences of friends of the people that they're supporting. Because, as Jane illustrated so well, what's happening for families is also has an impact on what's happening for the people with disability that are being supported. And it's also important for services to pay attention for outcomes for staff. What we've found in terms of the good culture work is that in organisations where staff are valued and staff are empowered, then that helps that culture of a shared responsibility. And staff taking responsibility for outcomes rather than seeing themselves as the bottom of the heap and, oh, we're just here to do our shift. So having a significant buy-in to what's going on. And so the question, I think, in terms of outcomes that services have to ask themselves is there a coherent framework for you as a service to think about the outcomes that you're trying to achieve for the people that you're supporting? There's lots of different frameworks for thinking about outcomes, so it really doesn't matter which one your service uses, but you need to have some coherent way of thinking about and articulating the outcomes that you're trying to achieve. And you also have to think about, what do these outcomes actually look like for the people that we're supporting? And predicated on that is, you actually have to know the people that you're supporting. Some of this work came out of some work that we did with a service, and we said to them, well, who are you supporting? What is the nature of your clients? And they couldn't tell us. They didn't know how many people or who in their service had an acquired brain injury and who had an intellectual disability. It was like, oh, they're just people with disabilities. But you need to think about outcomes are going to look different for different types of people. If you have a profound and severe intellectual disability and you don't have any intentional communication, then the outcomes for you in terms of engagement and choice and control are going to look very different from the outcomes of somebody with a mild intellectual disability who's going to life skills. So you have to translate those big picture outcomes into what are we expecting for the people that we're supporting? What does choice and control look like? And I think one of the problems is we haven't translated ideas about choice and control to people with severe and profound disabilities. We've talked about choice and control being able to choose your service, being able to choose your worker, those sorts of things. But for people with a severe and profound disability, they're not going to be able to choose their service. Their parent or their supporter or an advocate will be able to choose it for them. But what does choice and control mean for that person? And that often means something about what's happening in their day-to-day lives. Are they having music on when they get out of bed, or is it nice and quiet and peaceful? Does somebody give them the best possible shower that day, or does somebody just wheel them around without telling them where they're going? Do they have the option of a shower or a bath? Have they had those experiences? Are they given those choices? So it's thinking, an organisation needs to think, who are we serving and what do the outcomes that we're trying to achieve look like for the people that we're serving, not just anybody. And then are the problems, are the things that we're trying to achieve, have we problematised them and have we thought about them? It's very complex providing choice and control for even people with mild intellectual disabilities. You continually have an issue about, are they being manipulated? We heard Jane being accused of manipulation, where she thought she was supporting choice and control for her son, whereas the staff saw her manipulating her son. So are those concepts being unpacked and being problematised within your service? How do you work through those differences of opinions about the complexity of ensuring that you're supporting somebody to make an informed choice or the best possible choice they can, rather than being paternalistic or just saving the risk? Okay, so the next most important section is the practice. What is the quality of support that you as an organisation are providing? How are the frontline staff providing the support? What are they doing when they're on shift? What do staff do to encourage or discourage people's participation, people's engagement, people's choice and control? By their presence, by their speech, by the way they behave. How do they help people? How do they assist people? How do they help people to succeed and to be engaged? How do they interpret and mediate and support relationships when they're out in the community with the people that they're supporting? We spend a long time observing staff going out into the community. It's very interesting, when you talk to some services, they'll say, oh yes, we do that, we do community inclusion. People go to the coffee shop or they go to an adult learning centre and they've ticked that, we've done that. But when you go and look at what's actually going on, the staff member is really the person's companion, and the person is still in their little bubble with the person with a disability and the staff member, and they don't interact with anybody else because the staff member isn't mediating that relationship and helping people be included with the other people wherever they are. Are you prioritising good practice over good paperwork? How important is practice? How staff are behaving, how they're supporting people? Is it understood as being important by all levels of the organisation? Do senior managers, does the CEO, does the board understand about the importance of good practice? And you'll be amazed at how many organisations say, oh, if we're going to do this project about practice, well, you know, it's those people, the middle managers. We don't need to worry the CEO about that. That's not their business. They do other things. But actually the research shows that the practice should be the central thing that the CEO's interested in. So, do you have priorities about practice within an organisation? And are the staff practices adapted to take into account the different groups of people that are supported by the organisation? So there's a theme running through this. What you're doing in terms of practice actually relevant to the people that you're supporting and based on knowledge about those people and the group that those people belong to? So how then, from the day-to-day, in the day-to-day, is support organised? How are you translating from this wonderful person-centred plan that you might have done at a meeting somewhere else, how are you translating that into what happens every day for the person that you're supporting? We spent some time doing field work in an organisation, and one of my colleagues spent the night there. She did the night shift, and she'd asked the staff during the day, where are the person-centred plans that people had spent so much time working on before these people had moved out of Kew Cottages? And nobody knew where they were. So she had a rummage round during the night and found them in the kitchen cupboards up high where nobody else could reach. So there was nothing at all in that service that was putting those plans into what was happening every day. So they were a complete waste of time. So, are you organising support to line up with any plans that you might have done? Are you coordinating people's individual schedules? How does what you're providing in your service fit with what's being provided for that person in the other services that they might be using? And again, Jane gave a really good example of that disconnect that happens. How are you negotiating access for the people you're supporting to places and opportunities? And how, on the shift, are you allocating the support, the staff that are there? How are you using the staff to provide support to people? And how do you give guidance to the support, to the staff, on every single shift about the people that they're supporting? And that includes the casual staff who come in. How do they know what's expected of them? How do they know the people that they're supporting? How do they know which one is Nick? So the question for organisations then is, do you have mechanisms for staff to know what's expected of them on each shift that they work? Because if they don't know what's expected of them, how are they going to provide the right support to get the right outcomes for people? Do they have shift plans? You'd be astonished how many services don't have any plan for what people are going to do on their shift. One of the services that we talked to was mainly concerned with would people turn up? And when you said, well, how do you know what they're doing? They said, oh, well, we get them to ring in if they come and tell us if they're not coming. And that was the sole responsibility that they had. The important thing was turning up, not what they did on the shift. But you need to know that there's things in place to support people to do what you want them to do. And you need to provide guidance on every shift about what good practice looks like. And you need to provide supervision. And that's why in culture in good services, where there's a shared responsibility for the quality of services, that it's not only the practice leader that's worried about what's happening, it's every other staff member. So that if a casual comes in or if a tardy staff member comes in and behaves in a different way, other staff will pick them up. That it's everybody's responsibility for good practice. And our research shows that the way staff behave in a lot of services when the practice leader is there is very different from the way they behave when the practice leader isn't there. And that's a challenge. How can you make sure that they behave in the way you want them to behave all of the time, even when the nominated leader isn't there? So in terms of structures and policies and procedures, you need to think about design. This is about the design of service. Do you have a design to your service? Is there a program logic? Or as the new spin is there a theory of change? Do you have a sense of how you put together the staff and the structures in your service to create the outcomes that you're trying to achieve? We did a piece of work a number of years ago now which looked at retirement services for older people with intellectual disabilities. And everybody was obsessed at that time about models of service. They said, oh, you know, individualised service, specialist services for older people are much better than these traditional day programs. We looked at 5 different models, designs of services. And actually the best service was the traditional day service in Bendigo, because of the way it was designed inside that overarching traditional day service. It had individualised support for people. It had really good planning and it had really good practice. So it's not only the design, but it's how you put that design together. And there's many ways of getting the same outcomes, but you have to decide how you're going to put them together in your service. And is that based on any evidence about how you get those sorts of outcomes? So it's questions about how do you use buildings? How do you use spaces? Do you have buildings and spaces? Do you need to own buildings and spaces? And then how do you organise your staff? What's your staffing structure? How do you recruit staff? How do you train staff? How do you manage staff? How do you monitor what they're up to? And how do you get them to report? And one of the most significant things that services need is part of their design is, do they have a coherent practice framework that sets out the evidence that informs the practices that they're expecting staff to put into practice? Do they make that explicit? So does the organisation actually know the type of practice that it's expecting the staff to do? That can be based on active support, it can be based on positive behaviour support, it can be your own term. But does it assemble and make really clear to the people that are coming into your organisation to be staff what's expected of them and the type of practice that's expected? And you would be quite shocked at the number of organisations that don't have a practice framework, or the incoherency of some of the practice frameworks that they do have, that are basically sort of rhetoric and spin, which really haven't been well sort of thought out and designed. And then the question is, if you have a coherent practice framework, is it embedded in the expectations that you have and the skills of your frontline workers? So do they have job descriptions? And do the job descriptions reflect the aims of what you're the practice that you want staff to do? Does it reflect the knowledge that you want them to have? And does it reflect the skills that you're trying to recruit to? Do you have an orientation? When people come newly into your service, do you convey to them what the expectations are other than through their job description? Do you have just an induction which is about risk management and what forms to fill in and how to give out medication and where the keys are? Or do you actually have an orientation to the expectations around practice? Do you have a training calendar? Do you provide training of the right sort that is ongoing so that you get everybody as they come through and that you have refreshers and so on and so forth? Or do you just expect people to pick it up by osmosis? And are there policies around using casual staff? Are there policies around how new staff get to know the people that they're supposed to be supporting? So in some of the houses where we identified really good culture, they had really strong policies around orientation and around the use of casuals and around the use of new staff being orientated into the organisation. So people weren't allowed to work on shift. without having done a shadow shift with somebody else. And they actually had a very long period of probation and review for new staff. So that if those staff weren't sharing the values, if they'd articulated them, but then in practice you weren't seeing them happening, if you have a good period of probation, you can get rid of those staff before they become a problem. Because if you want to have shared values in your culture, you need people who come in or who are amenable to developing their values. So those sorts of frameworks and structures can actually affect the culture and what you're delivering. But you have to pay attention to them, and they have to be coherent. And in the services where there was really good culture, what we saw was this very explicit translation of values. There was no doubt left for the staff who were being recruited or the staff that were there about what was expected. This is a quote from the orientation of one of the services that we looked at. And it said, "This is what we expect of you. We expect you to treat all individuals with respect, dignity, empathy, sensitivity, and to listen, learn, and act on what people say." There's no doubt what's expected of staff. And yet how many organisations make that really explicit on that really concrete level to staff as they come in? And it's reinforced through language and communication policies that organisations have. How we expect you to talk to people. We use first-person language in this organisation. This is the acceptable language. Do we make that explicit? And are the artefacts, are the parts of the culture that are on display, do they convey what you're trying to achieve too? So is it clear to new staff that come in or to casuals that come in that the people that they're working with are people who have families, who enjoy fun, who enjoy particular activities, who are whole people, rather than just a service user. So it's about being clear and explicit what your practice framework and expectations are, and then diffusing them through lots of different ways in your organisation. And one of the key elements from the research that we've been doing now over the last 3 years is really clear that frontline practice leadership is one of the key variables. It's probably the A that you need in order to get good practice. We can now show a really clear relationship between good practice leadership and good outcomes, which means effective services, quality services. You have to have strong practice leadership. What we've done over the last 10 years probably is invest in training of frontline staff, on and on and on and on, but we haven't paid attention to practice leadership. And yet I think this is, and the research shows, this is the key to getting good outcomes. And there's 5 elements of practice leadership, which are around coaching, modelling, teamwork, supervision, and a focus on outcomes, on everything that the practice leader does, and therefore everything that's expected of the people that they're leading. So the question is, does your organisation recognise practice leadership? Is it articulated? And does it have structures in place that enable practice leadership to be put into practice? Do you provide paid, is there opportunity for paid team meetings for everybody who's involved in a team supporting a group of people? Is there formal supervision? Is there opportunity for coaching? Is there opportunity for modelling practice? So do your practice leaders, are they really good practitioners? Can they model good practice? Workers need to know what good practice looks like. They need to see it again and again, and to be corrected when they're not doing it. So is there an understanding of practice leadership and of practice framework embedded in the organisation, both in the structures, at the front line, and at middle management and at senior management? So do the job descriptions of the frontline leaders reflect those elements of practice leadership? And are their managers and their managers above them, do they reflect the aims of the organisation to deliver on the practice framework and to deliver on practice leadership? So is it valued in those, by those other managers? And do the organisational structures reflect a commitment and support to practice leadership? One of the things that we've found is practice leadership is a nice term, and we've identified its component parts, but the way it plays out at the front line is in many different ways. So some services have a dedicated practice leader or a number of practice leaders who are offline, and they're not the sort of frontline manager, they're the practice leader. But in lots of other organisations, the practice leader has other components to their job. So they're the house supervisor, who also does shifts, who also does administrative work, and they're expected to be the practice leader. And so the question is, have you given enough time in the person's job description and in their hours to be a practice leader? Or are they spending 99% of their time in the office doing the paperwork? Do they realise that they're expected to be a practice leader when they're on shift? How many times have you heard staff say, the frontline leaders say, the house supervisors say, well, you know, I'm a supervisor, I get 10 hours a week for doing that, and I do the paperwork in the office. The rest of the time, I'm just like everybody else, I'm just on shift. We need to make sure that every service, every team has a practice leader that is dedicated to those components of practice leadership, so that staff are being led and are getting that supervision and that modelling and so on. And this is just some examples of, in the houses where we found really good service culture and the strong practice leaders, those leaders were getting support from the organisation. So this quote comes from one of the practice leaders who felt she couldn't, you know, she was finding it really hard to do the job. There were some really difficult staff. They were just doing a babysitting service, and she could see there needed to be major change. But she felt she didn't have the skills to bring about that change. So the organisation invested in her and developed her skills to do that, and she was able to bring about a change in that service. And the way she did that was by developing her skills, by getting the backing of the service, and of actually getting rid of a couple of people and being backed up to do that, because those people's values were very different and they weren't lined up with the values and what the service's mission was. And one of the things that comes through this is that good practice leaders and the culture in those good group homes is where the leaders can not only talk the talk but can walk the talk. So they're good practitioners as well as being good managers, as well as being able to articulate those things. They can actually do it in practice and other people can see them doing it. And then we come to quality assurance. And one of the astonishing things is that quality assurance often sits somewhere else in an organisation, well away from practice, well away from the sort of management stuff. It's this thing that sits out there. But the question is, does quality assurance processes and procedures in your organisation, does it emphasise practice? Does it actually pay attention to the quality of what you're delivering in terms of support to people and therefore outcomes? And the question you have to ask, and comes from the research, is we actually know that observation is a very powerful way of monitoring and observing practice and of assuring quality. So you need to make sure that observation is a key component of management practice and of any quality assurance system. And that there's an expectation that the middle managers and the senior managers and the CEO will visit services and observe practice, and that staff really understand why they're coming. They're not coming to see if it's clean and tidy. They're coming to see the practice. Are people engaged in their lives? Are people exercising choice and control? So quality assurance practices need to have observation, but they also need to be able to capture examples of practice. So do you have mechanisms in your organisation that enable staff to describe the practice that they're doing and how they're supporting people and what some of the outcomes are for people? And increasingly it's easy to do that. People can write, people can take pictures, people can take movies now. You know, that sort of technology makes it much easier for people to be accountable and to observe what's actually happening in that moment of truth between the person and the staff member who's supporting them. So, are there coherent and consistent messages about the nature and importance of practice at all levels of the organisation? And that goes back to the policies and the language and seeing it coherently all the way through all the different policies in the organisations. And are there structures in place to manage the expectations of others about the service and about the expectations that you have of the quality of service that you're delivering? So are families on the same page as you? Do they know what you're intending to deliver? Do they know what you think an effective quality service looks like? Have you conveyed it to them? Do the community visitors know? Do the board members know? And one of the problems that we've just finished a piece of work which asked family members and asked staff what were the elements of good practice. And the family members had 5 elements, the staff had 5 elements, and they lined up. But there was a 6th element that the family members had that the staff didn't even mention. And that was what Jane talked about, which was collaboration. So families, a really important element of quality practice and quality services is collaboration with the service, is a sense of their knowledge, their perspectives being acknowledged by staff, being debated if necessary, but they're being people on the same page and collaborating about what you're trying to achieve. So do you have a policy about how you engage with families? How you engage with each individual family? Every family has different expectations, wants different types of knowledge, and that needs to be negotiated between each family member and each service. You need overarching policies, but you then need that individual negotiation. We've just finished a piece of work too for the community visitors, trying to shift what they do to much more observation. So instead of going in again and going to the office and looking at the paperwork and what is planned to happen, that they spend more time looking at what is actually happening. Because what we were hearing from services was that the community visitors were reinforcing neat tidiness and not a sense of the quality that the services were trying to produce. So you need to look at, well, who's coming into your services and are you having a dialogue with them about expectations of the quality of what you're delivering? Because if you're not, you're going to have conflicts and contradictions for your staff at the front line. They're not going to be getting the same message from the family members or the community visitors as you're trying to give to them. So you need to manage those relationships. I'm nearly there. And then the final element of final book 1 is around access and use of existing and new knowledge about practice, service design and client groups. Do you, as an organisation, are you linked into networks where you can acquire new knowledge? Do you have partnerships with places like universities where you can not only participate in research, but you can acquire through that relationship the new knowledge as it comes out? You know, every week there are lots and lots of papers that are published in academic journals that say all sorts of really key things about good practice, about particular impairments, about what works best, but they're often written in really academic, hard-to-reach style. But if you have a relationship with a university and a research team or some even academics that are just teaching, then you can get that knowledge distilled much easier. But if you have no relationships, then you have no access to that ongoing and developing knowledge. And I guess that's the thing about ongoing learning. You never know because there's always new knowledge coming up. And that's one of the most remarkable things about some of the agencies that have really good practice and good culture is that they never say that they've arrived. It's still part of the journey. And so they're always there at whatever's on around new information or even existing information because they can see it's a continual learning process. You never actually achieve the end of this journey. It's a never-ending journey. So do you have those things in place? And then is your mission and your public profile, does that value practice too? Do you convey to the outside world, in general, to your board members, to the public, the importance of practice and the importance of things that you're trying to deliver? And again, do you distill it down to examples of what good practice looks like, what good outcomes look like for the people that you're supporting? Or do you just use the sort of stand-in person with a mild disability who can look almost normal? So many brochures, so many websites portray choice and control and engagement as if it's something that's the same for everybody. And I think it's everybody's duty to portray it in its multiplicity. And the diversity of people with disabilities means there's a diversity of what those outcomes look like. And we need to start to acknowledge that diversity. It's not the same for everybody. So do you convey that in your profile? So just to finish off in terms of some conclusions, in terms of achieving quality outcomes, our research is showing over the last 3 years that we've been going with a group of organisations in Victoria that if we keep their focus by collecting observational data every year on practice, by going and watching and getting them to keep paying attention to it, that they can actually improve it. And they're on this sort of upward trajectory, but it requires this continual attention. Do you have a whole organisation commitment to a practice framework that includes active support or an appropriate framework for whatever the people that you're supporting in your organisation practice? Is it a coherent framework? Can you create and support the conditions for good staff practice? Do you have strong practice leadership or the elements of that within your organisation? Are there organisational processes that pay attention to the type of staff you're recruiting, to how they gain entry, to how you screen them from values and how you screen them out? And does that line up with the expectations that you have of them that are in your practice framework? Is there an explicit translation of values to expectations? And do you provide space for the people that work in your organisation to reflect on their values? It's very hard not to see the world through your own culture, through your own values, through your own preferences. And we all do the little things in life in our own ways, but we need to be aware of how we do those things so we don't impose them on other people. Otherwise, the people that you're supporting will have this inconsistent experience every day, depending on who's on duty. Is there a depth of knowledge within your organisation about the people that are being supported? Is there some prolonged engagement? Are there some staff that actually know people very well? And are there ways of passing on that information in a quick way to staff who are coming in more new to the organisation? And do you have mechanisms to create and recreate the cultural norms within your organisation that fundamentally have this regard for people and recognise the humanity of people with disabilities? And do you see those values and that culture coming out in all the talk and all the action that happens within the service? What we know is that staff will always overestimate what their outcomes are and the quality of their own practice. Our research shows this big gap. If you ask people, do they get practice leadership, they'll say yes. You ask practice leaders, do they do observation, do they do these things, they say yes. When you watch, you get a very different picture. So you need to make sure that observation is there and monitoring what's going on and providing a feedback loop rather than just relying on paperwork. You need to watch good practice, you need to reinforce good practice, and you need to tackle bad practice when you see it.